Years ago when I was a student, I discovered the work of Aldo Leopold. In the mid-20th century, he was this profound writer thinking about ecological and environmental issues. Most famously, he wrote something called the Sand County Almanac. Somewhere in his writings, I learned of that great story that's been oft repeated by many writers about Leopold's own adventure out west. He was a part of this great expansion into the West and development, the clearing of land for human use. As a part of a team of young men meant to kill coyotes and wolves and other apex predators, he tells of a particular time he was responsible for shooting a wolf. And then when he went to go survey the corpse of this wolf, he saw the wolf's dying breaths and the death throes of pain. And he describes this green fire, this life going out of the eyes of the wolf. And in that experience, something happened inside of him. The question, was it ethical to kill this animal, or why did this animal have to die? Those were questions that were in his mind for sure, but the questions pressed and went deeper. They haunted him. They began to take shape in other ways, like asking questions such as, what kind of animal is humanity anyway? What makes the human different, unique, or distinct from the wider, non-human world of other creatures? Are we any better at all? Do we have a moral or an ontological superiority? These sorts of questions have fueled the imagination of the environmental landscape for generations. Philosophers, theologians, religious thinkers, poets and artists, Thoreau, many people have asked that question, have thought through the stories and the traditions and the biology and the realities that we face. We are human animals. In some way, we're distinct from the world of other creatures. Is it because we have a certain level of intelligence or rationality, or because we can tell a joke? Is it because we can build the world of culture and society, and that's distinct? That question really fueled a lot of my research and study as a formal student studying philosophy and theology. I wrote my PhD asking the question about why we conceive of the world over here of humans and culture, versus a world of non-humans, animals, plants, and nature, and where those ideas come from and how they shape the way we live. I was driving in my car not long ago, and I heard that question brought up by a radio host in a new way. They were talking about this professor at the University of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. There is a scholar there who is a neuroeconomist, a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist, a writer named Gregory Berns, who is doing research on the psychological and perhaps emotional life of canines. It made me smile because I had a new little puppy at my house, and I often have wondered as I looked into my puppy, who's now a big dog named Tuck. So I looked into his eyes. I wonder, what does he think about? Does this dog love me? Does this dog rely on me? Do we have some sort of parasitic relationship in our home between the cats and the dogs and the people? Is there something more? How we relate to the world of animals and creatures, how we relate to the world that we also consume of animals and creatures, is fundamental to our everyday life. And because of that, it's a spiritual question. Today on Complex Creatures, the podcast where we explore spirituality and the common good, we're going to talk to Professor Gregory Berns. We're going to talk to him about these questions and perhaps more. It's going to be hopefully a wide-ranging conversation. He's the author of several books, Satisfaction and Iconoclast from 2009. He's been studying pet psychology, and recently he wrote a New York Times op-ed piece about his family's move to care for cows south of Atlanta. I think he thinks the cows might be good pets. Well, join us, my friends, as we talk with him and explore these questions further. Give this a listen. Dr. Gregory Berns, welcome to Complex Creatures. I came across your work because I was driving in the car, and I think I heard it on NPR. Don't hold me to it. But I was hearing about your research where people were talking about the question of what our dogs think and do our dogs love us? And then I've seen you in New York Times talk about this or be interviewed about it as well. Before we start asking that question, which I'm sure many people want to know more about what their dogs think and feel, let me ask you a little bit about who you are, your research, and how you got into researching animals, because you're a neuroscientist, correct?
Well, I'm many things. I've been many things. I guess to kind of give the brief overview, my career has been in academia pretty much my whole life. I guess I've never left school. Um, so I basically got a PhD in biomedical engineering way back in the 80s. And kind of through that, decided I was more interested in how the human body worked and what went wrong with it and ways to fix it. And so ended up going to medical school after that and became a physician. And in the course of that, it became really interested in how the brain works and again how things go wrong with it and what we can do to fix it, and did a residency in psychiatry and became a board certified psychiatrist, and then ended up at Emory University in Atlanta in the psychiatry department, where I was primarily a research physician using tools like MRI to study how the human brain works, how it makes decisions, especially with regards to risk and reward. And I was just doing that, doing really well, lots of grant funding for that. And then in 2011, for fairly random reasons, decided, wouldn't it be fun to get my dog to go in the MRI scanner just like people? If I could train her to do it, then I could actually see what she was thinking and whether she had anything like feelings of love towards me. And that launched a project that lasted over 10 years, which got quite large, and it became kind of a community science project where we trained lots of dogs to go in the MRI scanner, completely awake, unrestrained, and had them do all sorts of experiments, see how their brains responded, looked at service dogs, you name it. And then the pandemic came along and kind of that all came to an end, and I decided to move to a farm, and that's where I am now and have fallen in love with cows.
That's incredible. We're going to talk more about those things in a minute, but by way of a little background for you about myself, in seminary, I took a course called neurotheology, and the concept was to study neurology alongside of traditional understanding of the soul or spirit or what the mind is. And it really was fascinating to try to parse through ancient language with a contemporary understanding of the body. And it basically just made me perpetually interested in neurology for sure. But ultimately, I think it had its own way of shaping the research I would do for my PhD in theology, which I was really fascinated in asking the question about environmental philosophy and environmental storytelling for what are some of the ideas that have created us into developing certain sorts of societies that are rather despotic towards the non-human world. And one of the things that I found through a lot of the research was this just basic assumption that there's this duality between nature and culture, and that there's the world of culture, the world of humanity, laws and art and all that happy stuff. And on the side of nature was the non-human world and the animal world and so on. And there's this big bifurcation that was present throughout a lot of Western thought. And of course, it's really a poor way of conceiving the world. Humans are animals. From a Christian perspective, there isn't creation that you can point to because you yourself are creation too. So the relationships are much more interdependent and reciprocal and nuanced. And so the question is, for me, is always like, how then do we conceive of ourselves as humans and our way about this world in a way that are we distinct and unique from animals? And if so, how? And does it matter? And, there's 1,000 ways to kind of go at it. But it seemed to me that as I understood more about animals were not just they weren't as lacking in sophistication in a lot of cases as we might think. That animals in some ways may create culture. They may have complex feeling. And so once I heard about your study, I wanted to talk more with you about maybe even my dog and what my dog might be able to think and feel. What were some of your initial findings in the MRI machine?
Well, I mean, you're exactly right. And, from my perspective now of having studied human brains and dog brains, as well as some other animal brains, I see more similarities than differences. Um, I've focused on mammals, so dogs are mammals like us. I've also looked at the brains of sea lions, dolphins, even the extinct Tasmanian tiger, and when you look at all these animal brains, you can see that they look very similar.
Mm.
They're different in size, obviously, because the animals are different in size, but you can find all the same basic parts, and that's especially true for regions that we think have to do with emotions, in particular. Um, and so, based on that, I think that yes, indeed, that all animals, especially mammals, I kind of hard pressed to think about insects, but let's just talk about mammals. Probably experience a lot of the emotions that we do because they have the same basic architecture there to do it. And so one of the things we did with the dogs, to get kind of the basic question about whether your dog loves you, because that seems to be what everyone wants to know these days. And we can talk about that. We did some very simple tests. We basically trained the dogs on some neutral cues, and this is just Pavlovian conditioning. And one cue was, these were objects we held up in front of them in the scanner. One cue signaled that they would get a treat, a food treat, and another cue signaled that their owner would pop into view and say, "Good girl," and just praise them and love on them. And then the question was, are there different responses in the brain to those two things? And the answer for most of the dogs, about 3/4 of dogs, was no, there isn't. It evoked the same reward-related response, which to me suggested that the dogs liked, at least we'll just call it kind of social reward. You can call it love if you want. But that has equal weight to them as food. And it's a very similar response in humans, that we have this reward system that responds to all sorts of rewards. But I think the one that we care the most about, beyond survival is these social feelings, especially affiliation and positive things like that. And we saw it in the dogs. And for some dogs, it was actually a stronger response for that social reward than food itself.
Mm. So when I think a lot about just the studies of way we relate to animals, there seems to be, at least in anthropology study that I read, a lot of distinction between the way we think about animals in the wilderness and then animals through domestication. Is there any kind of science or scientific research you've done on brain structural change through domestication of animals? Or, I guess it's a rather unsophisticated question, but do wolves have the same sort of makeup, you would think, than say my dog at home that's a half boxer, half Bernese mountain dog? I mean, the same capacity for love, if you will, or affection?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I've studied not living brains, but I have brain specimens from coyotes. So that would be a very close analogy to a domestic dog, closer in size actually than a wolf. And generally, kind of across the board, what we find with domesticated animals and their wild counterparts is the domesticated versions tend to be a little bit smaller. The brains tend to be a little bit smaller.
Hmm.
So scientists argue about what that means. Kind of the popular theory is that, well, domesticated animals don't, really have to survive in the wild. So it kind of takes less brain real estate, to get through a day.
Hmm.
And that may be true. It may be hard to, I don't know if we can prove that. there's something, with dogs in particular, they have hitched their wagon to humans very successfully in the sense that, certainly in this country, we feed them, we house them. They don't have to do much of anything other than just, be cute and be friendly. Um, so it's possible that they just don't need as much brain real estate to do that. Um, what, you had asked me a little bit ago about kind of, similarities and differences with humans. The obvious one is language.
Mm.
And that's the one I think that everyone can agree on, that as far as we know, only humans have language. And when and we have to distinguish between communication and language, because all animals communicate. Um, whereas as far as we know, only humans have language in the very specific linguistic sense that we use words as abstract representations of things in the real world,
Nice.
nouns and verbs, and we have syntax and grammar, um, which is the thing that allows us to communicate in ways that are much richer than just simple grunts and so on. And importantly, in my view, kind of the biggest thing that language allows humans to do that no other animal does is to tell stories. And it allows us to make sense of our world in stories that we tell. And I think that's kind of fun. That is what it fundamentally means to be human, is to tell a story and a narrative explanation for how the world works.
Yeah, we tend to tell after the modern period, we tell ourselves that we're just these really rational beings, and there is rationality. It doesn't mean the dogs don't have a certain level of rationality. Would you agree with me that dogs can, at least if they see a leash, maybe think that means a walk is to follow? That's a certain level of rationality.
Oh, for sure. And, through much of the 20th century, most scientists kind of took a very behaviorist view of animals and dogs in particular, where they were kind of just these stimulus response machines where, like Pavlov is like, oh, this
Right.
start salivating, and there's not really a whole lot of thought that goes into that. That view, I think, has pretty much fallen away for the most part, at least those of us who are kind of studying animals, I would say in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. We find that they have the capacity to represent their world in ways that simple, what we call associative learning or Pavlovian conditioning can't explain. And
Hmm.
so what that means is that a dog, all the animals out there, kind of have these representations in their head of their world and the other animals in it. And so for dogs, that means they have representations of us. They don't, they're not going to know our names. They're not going to kind of call up an image of us in their head. And, then my dogs don't think, oh, there's Greg. That's not, they don't have labels like that. They don't use labels. But we did do some experiments where we actually made videos for the dogs to watch in the scanner, essentially dog content. We had like a little steady cam and took, videos at dog parks and people eating, dogs eating, playing, all sorts of things that we think dogs do, and developed some fairly sophisticated computer models of what was going on in their brain, and ultimately came to the conclusion that the dog's brains were representing what was happening.
Mm.
Much an action-oriented view of the world, not so much like labeling. So we humans label everything. There's roughly 10 times as many nouns as verbs in the English language. So we're obsessed with, we have names. We're more concerned with who and what something is rather than what they're doing. Whereas I think for most animals, it's the other way around. And so, yeah, they have these very complex representations of the world, which, yeah, they're rational because They have to be.
And spiritually or theologically speaking, depending on your tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's this notion that humans are made in the image of God. And, that's been a rich thing to think about over the generations and centuries. Does that mean we're rational? Well, yeah, we're rational, but like I just tried to say, we're not the only rational beings. We might be rational to a certain degree of height or complexity better or beyond other animals. Is it our sense of humor? Is it our sense for community? It seems as though the other animals create some sense of community. But there's something in what you're saying about how humans are storytelling and story-formed creatures, labeling. I mean, there's something about, I think, in Genesis, where Adam and Eve name the creatures, this labeling aspect. If you read it on one level, it just seems like a narrative, just a simple step in the progression of a story. Well, of course, it's their job to name the animals. But there are other more layered readings that talk about this being part of the priestly role of humanity. Like that's like a heightened position in the world to actually bestow a name upon a thing, which is kind of playing off of what you just said there, that we have so many more nouns than verbs, and we name and label our world.
I suppose. I mean, one interpretation of that would imply that humans have dominion over animals.
Yes.
Virtue of the fact that we name them. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think my view is that we coexist on this planet together, and as kind of the species, we humans are the ones who are running the show now. And responsible for all the good and bad things that happen, that it is our responsibility to take care of the planet and all the creatures on it. So does that make them within our dominion? I suppose in that sense, that I think we do have an obligation to take care of the planet.
That was actually part of the research that I did for my doctoral work that I was fascinated by. The language of dominion, the human role is kind of a steward. Even though the word steward, it's got positive connotations, it still has a very managerial connotation as well, where humans are on top of a food chain. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that those were more like those threads of interpretation were punched up and kind of as we went through the height of the medieval period and into the Enlightenment world, but more kind of an ancient reading, especially in Hebrew, this Hebrew word radah, where they get the word of dominion and mastery, could be read that it's not mastery over as much as mastery among. The language is more like a shepherd walking amidst the sheep. It was a much more, not egalitarian, but still at the very same time, a much more reciprocal a way of being with creation, not over creation, or with animals and not over the world. And so that was something that I was very fascinated by as I went and researched some other ways of imagining the human relationship to the non-human world. And that's what I prefer to call it, by the way, the non-human world, because we're animals too, right?
Right. That certainly resonates with me, and that's certainly something that I've become very aware of since moving to the farm.
Well, talk about that a little bit. I that was a great op-ed. My wife's a farm gal, and we live in Atlanta. We have 11 chickens, 2 dogs, 2 cats, a bunch of fish. She would love to homestead, and so I sent her your article. Cows are like puppy. What's the title of it? I don't have it pulled up right now.
Well, the Times changed it a few times, but it was basically cows are the new puppies. Something.
Cows. I pulled up cows are the new puppies, which is really sweet. Can you tell us about? And we'll come back to some of your work with the dogs, but you moved to a farm and now you raise cows, right? Can you talk about that? Yeah, tell me about that.
And I wrote a book about it called Cowpuppy.
Yeah.
So, like I said, yeah. So with the pandemic came changes, and my wife and I picked up and moved from suburban Atlanta, and probably one of the most impulsive things that we've done. And we just bought the farm. And so we now live about 50 miles south of the city. It's still a rural area, although I can tell you over the last 4 years, I can feel the city is creeping closer. but we were lucky to have 85 acres here. About 20 acres of it is pasture, which it was previously a horse farm. And my original idea was, well, it was kind of vague. I had kind of this homesteading idea where I would be growing vegetables and fruits and vegetables, and selling the extra stuff at the farmers market, and just providing for the community, as well as learning how to manage the land. Um, it's not that simple.
Right. Yeah.
Um, as I said, so like I said, I've been in school a long time. I've studied medicine. Um, I would put farming, the amount of knowledge and work, it's extremely difficult. And I would put it as hard as medicine. There is so much to learn. And it's not written down. You don't go get a textbook on how to farm, although there are many books with similar titles. The knowledge that you need to manage the land is entirely local. Um, there are microclimates on our property. I go from I can go 1,000 feet and I can feel the temperature differ by a couple degrees. You go down a little hill and you hit a thermocline, and some things grow in some places. The soil's better in some places than others, and how do you know this stuff? I mean, there's no textbook. The internet doesn't help you with stuff like that. So it's an extremely steep learning curve. And one of the things you learn when you're growing food, whether it's vegetables or livestock, nature will try to take it. Nature wants to take back what we're doing.
Mm.
It's insects. Insects will eat your plants. Predators will eat your chickens. The forest will encroach back on your pastures, and so it is constant work to do this. And I think certainly I didn't appreciate how difficult it is, and I suspect kind of in the modern era where we go to the grocery store and buy our food, I mean, nobody's aware of this anymore. And so in kind of that evolving story, I've had these pastures, and I thought, well, this is ridiculous. These pastures, I was spending a lot of time mowing them, and I said, well, I need animals to do this, and so the fencing dictated the animals to get, and so I ended up with miniature cows, primarily initially as a means to graze the pastures with the goal of collecting their manure to compost to put into the food garden, which sounds great on paper. Like I said, you can find many books advocating that. But making it happen is not that easy. And in the process, I found that I fell in love with the cows, that they were incredibly social. In comparison to the dogs, they really don't ask for much, because, if you manage the pastures, then they're surrounded by their food. So they don't beg for treats, although they do like treats. And they eventually accepted me into their herd. And now, most days, if the weather's nice, I'll go out and just sit down with them while they're chewing their cud. And like I said in the op-ed, just kind of fall asleep and just be very grounded by them in ways that I haven't found in any other animals.
That's delightful. My father-in-law was a farmer, and I'm from central Illinois, and it's funny when I come across people who don't know the farming type. There's the stereotype oftentimes that agricultural folks may not be maybe even intelligent. I always laugh. It's not, as you said, it's not easy, and the amount of tradition as well as ingenuity and creativity that goes into it is just not something that you would guess. So, I sympathize with what you're saying. I also, my wife and I enjoy Clarkson's Farm on Amazon Prime. Have you seen that show?
I watched parts of the first season. I did enjoy it. And it actually was educational for me, because especially in the first year that he was doing it, I saw all the mistakes that he made, and I I mean, I still make many mistakes, not necessarily his mistakes. I make my own mistakes.
You don't buy a Lamborghini tractor that doesn't fit in your barn.
Uh, I totally related to that because when I bought this farm and I was negotiating for the purchase, there was a tractor here. I said, okay, throw in the tractor, we have a deal. I was like, okay, done. Like, great.
Uh-huh.
So I bought a farm and a tractor. I've never owned a tractor in my life. Um, so got like to me, a big green tractor. Um, and so what I learned the first season, so these tractors usually it's not big enough that the cab was enclosed, but there was a way to put up a canopy over the sun off you, which is important in our summers here because it gets blazing hot. Um, the person I bought from never actually used the canopy. He left it for me kind of off to the side, and I didn't understand why until I tried to put it on. So I put it on, and I realized that with it on, it didn't fit under the shed that it was stored in. Exactly Clarkson's problem too.
Well,
Yeah.
I bring the show up because we've watched several seasons. Actually, we watched it with our kids as well. And I noticed that as he's doing his experiment, he gets a great thought. Hey, I'm going to get cows. They're going to mow. We're going to do the whole manure and get chickens to scratch the manure. It's going to help. And of course, he comes across all these obstacles. But every time he gets animals, whether it's been the sheep or the cows, he gets very personally attached to them. And he actually has to get rid of cows, and it's very emotional for him. And I wanted to ask you about that because of your obvious relationship you have with your cows. What is it that you think that happens to us as humans that we get so attached, even not just to dogs and cats, but to farm animals? Like, why do you think as an animal ourselves we form those attachments with other sorts of animals?
I think we're wired that way. I mean, we're social animals. You know, easily form bonds with each other, especially with people that we, find to be like-minded and agreeable. Of course, we will form a bond with them. And animals in particular, um, they're I don't want to say they're forgiving creatures. I mean, because I think that they actually have very good memories, but um, because they don't have language, they never say anything ill about us, right? So the human, that's like the worst thing when someone says something bad about you.
Right.
And so yeah, I mean, it's very rewarding to have them and be with them, because they'll never say anything bad about me. And as long as I take care of them, they seem very happy to have me in there too. And so, yeah, like I said, I fell in love with them, and I couldn't sell any of my cows. And now I don't eat beef because it's too hard. Um,
I did watch the My Octopus Teacher, that documentary. I don't know if you've seen it, but I don't think I can eat octopus after watching that. I mean, it just blew my mind maybe how sophisticated the creature was. Um, I still don't really have any notion of how sophisticated. It just appeared to me to be much more um, capable of relationship and intelligence than I thought. I don't know if have you ever done any research on those creatures?
I haven't. We've talked about it, but they're obviously difficult to
Sure.
study. Um, it gets very tricky because people, when I talk about this stuff, people ask if I'm vegetarian or vegan, and I'm not. Uh, and I kind of go through kind of a rather circuitous explanation of my thoughts on food, which I mean, I guess we might as well address,
Yeah.
because it's the elephant in the room, right? Um, so one of the things, and I have been kind of various shades of vegetarian through parts of my life, but now I don't really call myself that because it's kind of like they're absolute terms. I don't like the terminology because terms imply like it does. They're black or white. It's like, you don't eat animal products. Well, what does that mean if you do once a year? Does that mean you fell off the wagon and you're no longer able to have that label? So I don't like
Right.
the labeling to begin with. I don't eat a lot of meat, but I try to be mindful of it when I do, as best as we can, know where it came from, how it was raised. Um, Out here in the country, we have many deer, and they're constantly trying to undo the work that I do for the cows, and so we will eat venison now instead of beef.
Yeah.
Not much, but um, comes back to this notion of stewardship. It's like, well, how do you go about living in this environment and achieve some kind of balance between what we take from the world and then what are we going to, how do you return that and nourish the land and hopefully leave it better for the next person to come along? I wish I had an answer to that. But it's a journey to try to figure it out.
Well, listen, Professor, I want to tell you, I'm a pastor of a congregation here in Midtown. So it's a historic congregation here in this church, and I've been in other churches before here, and so that means that I've tried with many different contexts to preach not only the message of our faith, but showing how I believe that very much part of our faith is the care of creation, and addressing things like climate change. And in every setting I've been in has been a challenging thing to do because people have wedded those ideas to partisan politics in ways that makes it's just a challenging first step for some reason to get a large group of people just to accept the realities of climate change and the humanity that's involved in it. So at least for me, my best way into the conversation is about food and how we grow and raise our food. And the best way I've been able to help people see the relationship we have is to get them to grow or at least have a closer relationship to their food source. The veils that are put in between us and our food are tremendous. As you mentioned, the grocery store. And then there's the labeling, nature zone, whatever it is. I mean, it all looks nice and idyllic and pastoral and all that. But you and I know that all that's just a label. And so it's been in my background. If I can get folks getting their hands a little dirty, seeing what it takes to make a tomato plant flourish, and how wonderful it is that you can have like umpteen varieties of tomatoes that all taste with nuanced differences, and how lovely all that is, to get them more wedded to that. I have a greater chance of getting them more engaged in the broader question of what we do in the world and how, you know what I'm trying to say? It's been through food though that I've been my most effective at getting people to see that.
What's your favorite tomato?
Oh, I probably like Brandywine tomatoes. Yeah.
Cherokees.
Yeah. One time, so in my former congregation was in Central Illinois, which is some of the best soil in the world. We had all this land that existed for no other reason except for to mow it and to like once a year have a volleyball game. So I said, let's do some community gardens, and we ended up having a tremendous amount of gardening, and it drew a lot of folks, and we were able to feed a lot of people. But because the guy who we put in charge of it was crazy about tomatoes, he put like 17 varieties in, and they were all harvested it. Like there's like a overlap of time where we could get them all at once, and we just lined them all up on the counter and sliced them up and just took one at a time and tasted them. And it changed my life. I mean, the complexities and nuances of all of it, it was enchanting to me to experience the flavors and the richness of it. Yeah. So personal, that just tied me right back to the land. So this podcast, we talk about how as the human, we're complex creatures. And the argument I like to make is that spirituality is, in our world, we tend to think of that as a tool for spiritual or self-growth. But my argument is it's an under-tapped resource for, the common good. And also an underlying assumption is that, spirituality might even be something that non-spiritual people or non-religious people practice or think about or look for, especially if that means the way I think most people take spirituality is the question of how we connect to that which is greater than ourselves. So to me, connecting to animals, connecting to the land is kind of a spiritual concept. Uh, would you agree with that for you? I mean, you don't have to have a leaning that way, but I just wonder if for you, if it touches on something a little deeper.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but any spiritual experience I've had has always been outside.
Mm.
Most of my life, I have, I've always done things outside. I grew up in Southern California way back. Grew up in Orange County when there were actually orange groves there, and I grew up in
Mm.
area that was then rural but still full of orange groves, and I spent my childhood to run through orange groves and having horses and just being outside, and that is very much a part of who I am. Um, I realize now in hindsight through much of my career, especially living in cities, how much I missed that because I didn't realize how much I missed that till I moved out to the farm. And now I spend, as much time outside as I possibly can. Um, and yeah, it is spiritual. Um, in the sense that when I'm outside, and especially if I'm with the animals, I feel connected to something bigger than myself.
Mm, mm. Do you, on a practical level, now that you have all that land and you're farming it, and it's as challenging as it is, is it challenging to maintain your work at the university and your writing and research and all that as well?
Well, the university has, I think, been very accommodating of my interests as they've changed over the years. And I'm at kind of a later point in my career where I don't have as active a research program. The beautiful thing about being at a university is if you can find ways to do your research, whether it requires funding or not, you're allowed to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so my challenge lately has been finding students who want to study cows.
Yeah.
I have a couple of kids now who are interested. So now we're starting to get some projects off the ground where we're going to try to understand how cows think.
That's incredible. So obviously, the connection to the land and the animals is a life-giving thing for you. But looking at this lovely screenshot of you, looks like you have some really great, beautiful walls with art. But you have a guitar over your shoulder. I bet that brings you some joy. Are you a big guitarist?
I'm a very amateur guitarist. Yes, I've played all my life, mostly just casually. But there was a period when I got very serious about it and wanted to make music with other people, and joined a few just pick up garage bands with other middle-aged guys who had nothing better to do and dream
That's a lot.
stars.
Hey, that's awesome. I actually last Thursday interviewed a couple. They met in seminary. She's a clergy person, and he does regenerative farming. And this is up in Kentucky, and he's a banjo player and plays in bands. And he tells me that he gets his best. He basically does roots music. He gets his best songwriting out from the land. He says the land talks to him when he's out on the tractor and whatnot. He jots down stuff, and it's inspirational for his music making, which I thought was pretty cool. Music tied to the land. Yeah. Do you have any great recommendations for documentaries or books, or if someone was interested in the topics that you're talking? I mean, I mentioned that you have that op-ed piece, but you said you had Cowpuppy, your book that has come out. What else would you recommend?
I've written 6 books. Not all of them are good. Cap is the one I'm most proud of. It's my most recent one. If you're interested in the dog stuff, there's How Dogs Love Us. And so that was a book I wrote about training dogs to go in MRI scanners. Then there was a follow-up called What It's Like to Be a Dog. So that goes even deeper into it. The one after that, which may or may not be of interest to folks, is called The Self Delusion. And that is a book that's not about animals. That's more about how our brains construct narratives to make sense of the world, and the notion that who we think we are, ourself, is a form of delusion in the sense that ourself is just the story that we're telling about ourselves.
I actually have that ordered in my Amazon. It's coming because I think that's a very valuable. Well, I can see it as well. Hopefully, the study is useful, but it's a useful. Um, Okay, without having yet read it, it's a useful thing for me to realize that is, I think, through my own life, the feelings may be important, they may be data points, but they're not identical to reality. And there are ways in which we construct the stories. I already know that I construct stories that are sometimes helpful and sometimes are not helpful. And so I was really curious when I came across that book to see what you have to say, and hopefully it might even make me think a little bit better about how I construct my own story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
kind of the essence of it. So before I was studying dogs and other animals, that's most, I studied humans. In fact, we had done some studies about on narrative and how people process narrative. And what's interesting about narratives, and we actually studied how a novel, a fictional novel changes the brain.
Mm.
It we found evidence that it kind of weaves itself into our brain's representation of the physical body.
Hmm.
Um, so it's as if when you're reading a story, I think especially fiction, you kind of get in the shoes of the protagonist. A good story will transport you in to the protagonist or other characters, and that is literally represented in your brain, in your body, like if you were literally in that other person's body. And there's evidence that those traces stay with you. So everything that we consume, whether it's something that another person says, something that you read, something that you see, it all gets into our brains and kind of, gets jumbled up in this soup of stuff that we think of ourselves. And it is us, but it's not just us, if that makes any sense.
That does. Did you ever do any thinking about whether or not the POV, the point, the POV shot in a film, did anything in particular to us as the viewer, or looking from the point of view of like the villain or something like that? I wonder about that.
That, and I mean, I don't know if anybody has studied that.
Well, it just made me think that because I know as I take stories, and that you're right, you put yourself in that perspective, but the idea that you carry it with you, that's interesting. Wow. I wish we could talk more about that, but maybe another time. That's fantastic.
Well, and it's not just that. It's actually, I think, the stories that we hear as children are probably the most powerful ones because those are the first stories that we hear. And they lay down the template for everything that comes after that. So you can go back and start thinking about kind of all those childhood stories, fairy tales, Disney movies, what have you. They're all in there, and they've all kind of they bias how we take in new information. And so the important thing is, first off, realizing that who you are is who you think you are, but it also comes from all these extraneous sources. And once you realize that you realize that who you are is the story of your life, it gives you the power to essentially write your own story. Once you
That's incredible. That's very useful. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and it's been a joy to just hear your story. In fact, I consider you a kindred spirit, and I'm going to get your other book on Cowpuppy and give it a read. And I thank you so very much, and I appreciate the work that you do. And I'm just hopeful that my wife doesn't make me buy a farm 50 miles away, because I don't know if I can do that and this job at the same time. Yeah.
it might be in your future. It's addictive.
Yeah.
And what actually has surprised me the most, apart from what I already said, is how much I love the people here.
Oh, wow.
To be honest, living in suburban Atlanta, I did not have many friends. I mean, I knew my neighbors, but never quite felt at home there. I feel at home here.
That's incredible. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
God bless.